Hey, do you remember when you were a kid and someone would ask you, if you only had one wish, what would you wish for? More wishes, right? Okay, here's a question like that. If you could know everything there was to know about one subject, what subject would you pick? I would pick consciousness. Because I have a suspicion that if I knew everything there was to know about consciousness, I'd know everything there was about everything. So how does someone study consciousness? Let's see, they could read a lot of books about the subject. They could do a search on the internet. They'd go to a library. Volunteer at a research foundation where they put electrodes in people's heads. And maybe in 10 years, they would be considered an expert. They could quote from William James and Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung and Jung. You see how you get Jung? That's the expert pronunciation. And they could talk about ego and id and superconsciousness. And they could name drop Baba whatchamacallit and Ken Wilber. And eventually they could write a book and call it, What is Consciousness? Now, of course, in the meantime, when they're not completely absorbed in their books, their life feels empty, lonely, meaningless. And their book on consciousness, it's not selling as well as Deepak's book on consciousness. And the last two jobs they had fell through. And their girlfriend is dropping them for a part-time lawnmower mechanic. So, sad story. Now I could go on, but what's wrong with this picture? They are lost in concepts. Now, a concept is something that is thought or imagined. Somebody has thought up or imagined it. And you see, they haven't really been studying consciousness at all. They have been studying concepts of consciousness. Can you imagine studying food and never eating any? I mean, you could be an expert on cuisine and starve to death. Now, there are two kinds of knowledge. There's secondhand knowledge of things that you've heard or read about, and there's firsthand knowledge that you've gained from personal observation and experience. Now, the purpose of both kinds of knowledge is to do something. I mean, to accomplish something, to change something that exists into something better. And the problem with our student of consciousness is that he's an expert in concepts about consciousness, but he can't do anything about the real problems of life. And while he has a lot of second-hand knowledge about consciousness, he lacks the skill to change his life into something better. Maybe he can make better concepts, but they're still not going to help him. You know, it's time for him to look inward, time for him to do avatar. If you want to explore the powers and the pitfalls of your own consciousness, you have to look inward. And every human being has a privileged access to a private universe of consciousness. private universe of consciousness in which he can be king, emperor, or even God Almighty if he so desires. And sadly, a lot of people have wandered into this kingdom and they're lost. They bottle up a little bit of consciousness and they call it their mind. And now trying to look at consciousness from a bottled up bit of consciousness is to become lost in mirrors. If they had known that there was a viewpoint which can be aware of consciousness but remain independent, they would have been all right. Avatar again. So they're in their bottle and they have forgotten the way in and the way out. They don't know what they are, or who they are, or where they are, so they make something up. And now they're thoughts floating in a bottle. I mean, imagine living in a magic kingdom where you own everything, and you're the only real person, and yet you choose to bottle yourself up and play the role of victim. How foolish is that? The product of Avatar is a source being. I seem to keep saying that over and over. The product of Avatar is a source being. An awake source being who has experientially realized that he or she is not a body, is not bottled up consciousness, is not thoughts, memories, or imaginations floating in the bottle. An awake source being is a self-determining, non-material spirit. Compassionate, positive, and responsible. And the reason I say awake is because everybody thinks he's a source being, but not every source being has had an experiential awakening. And if a source being is awake, they have the power to deliberately create, discreate, or reorganize, rebottle consciousness. And if a being isn't awake, they're stuck in think-its, and their actions are indoctrinated. If you decide that you're happy, but I tell you you're unhappy, who's right? I mean, the only way I can be right about your universe is if you decide to allow me to be right. And if you agree with me that you are not happy, then you can blame me for making your life unhappy. Well, that's where my work. And pretty soon you're going to have to call me to determine whether or not you're hungry. See, that's acute codependence, very far removed from source being. And there are a lot of people competing to define each other's consciousness rather than honestly confronting their own. But there are also beings who would be, that you would be happy to have influence your universe. I guess what I'm saying is there are good influences and bad influences. And the good influences will remind you that you're source. And the bad influences will encourage you to blame others. A blame is assigning the cause of how you feel to the consciousness that you have bottled for someone else. You really want to trade the role of source being for victim bottle? I didn't think so. So it's good if we gain some first-hand knowledge of your own conscious landscape. Unfortunately, first-hand knowledge can be wrong. You can acquire first-hand knowledge that is false, especially if you're looking at it from a bottle. You can misinterpret something that you experience. And it's common for eyewitnesses to an event to describe the event entirely differently. Eyewitness testimony, even though it is first-hand knowledge, is notoriously inaccurate. Around 1920, the Harvard Psychology Department threw out introspection as a reliable tool for studying consciousness. All reports based on introspection were invalidated by the declaration that people only see what they expect to see. And Harvard's fail-safe argument was that if you really studied consciousness by introspection, the only thing you would see would be consciousness introspecting on itself. Now, there's a guy named Copthorne MacDonald. He's a writer, an independent scholar. And he notes that after rejecting introspection, quote, psychologists turned almost exclusively to behavior as described in terms of stimulus and response, and consciousness was totally bypassed as a subject. A survey of 8 leading introductory psychology texts published between 1930 and the 1950s found no mention of the topic of consciousness in 5 texts, and in 2 it was treated as a historical curiosity. So is it true that when looking inward you always see what you expect to see? Have you ever had a dream in which something happened which you didn't expect? I mean, you probably have. So the statement, people only see what they expect to see, is not always true. And nullifying introspection was a mistake that wouldn't be corrected for 50 years. Now, what psychologists should have done was to develop techniques of consciousness inspection that would result in accurate data. But they dropped the ball and they went down a wrong path. So consciousness might have been a dead subject if it wasn't for events like China's invasion of Tibet, which had the unforeseen consequence of turning Tibetan Buddhism loose on the world. Or the serendipitous rediscovery of LSD by a Harvard psychologist named Timothy Leary. Or the transcendental meditation fad that swept the world after the Beatles. Remember them? And in the 1960s, a human potential movement began that's still growing today, and its preferred method of research includes many varieties of looking inward. And the message is that the more you understand the operation of your own consciousness, the brighter, happier, and more successful you will become. Now, there really aren't very many people who disagree with that. Looking inward, learning about your own consciousness is variously called meditation, introspection, or self-examination. And there are skills in doing these effectively. Now, since consciousness is all around you, Looking inward has nothing to do with the inside of your head. Yeah? Looking inward describes a specialized focus of awareness rather than a direction. I mean, you can look through a pane of glass, or you can adjust your focus and look at the glass. And you can look through consciousness, or you can adjust your focus and look at consciousness. So looking inward is a special kind of focusing. You're not trying to see your skull from the inside. And the fact is, you're not going to learn how to control or change or structure your life without focusing on your own consciousness. And the second part of this is that you're not going to learn anything useful if you look with expectations, assumptions, desires, and resistances. If you look up at the ceiling and you recall that the ceiling once fell on me and it broke my leg, and now your observations are colored by that, you know, the more you think about it, the less ceiling you see. You know, looking and experiencing are about 100 times more effective than thinking and remembering. And you know from the Avatar Define It exercises that you can cultivate a state of mind that just sees things as they are, uncolored by memories or judgments. And that state of mind is even more important when you focus on the influence that your own consciousness is having on your life. So, this is the first skill level of looking inward. You have to look without judgment or expectations. And you have to look for what is there rather than looking through or dreaming or imagining what you would like or not like to see. Have you ever heard the expression, the fourth wall? Let me tell you about the fourth wall. It's an imaginary, invisible wall at the front of a theater stage, and through which the audience views a play. Movie sets are built with 3 walls, and the camera and the director sit behind the imaginary fourth wall. And the actors pretend that the fourth wall is solid. And so between the show and the people who are watching the show, there's this imaginary fourth wall. And what the fourth wall allows is, if you're in the audience, is for you to observe without any concerns for your safety, or without any concern that you're going to be called upon, or that anything will be expected of you. And the fourth wall allows you to meditate undisturbed upon the movie or the performance. Have you ever gone to a movie and you become so involved that you forget yourself? Yeah? That's because you have relaxed into the simple awareness that low lighting, comfortable seats, and the fourth wall encourage. And your bottled up consciousness identity has dropped away. Do you think that people realize that when they're going to the movie that it's a form of meditation? Yeah. It is. And creating a fourth wall between you and the show allows you to explore consciousness with subjective objectivity. In some circles, this is called mindfulness. So let me use this analogy of the fourth wall to go over the levels of looking inward from subjective objectivity. The first thing that you see when you shift your focus to consciousness is your life story. That's bottled consciousness. And okay, that's entertaining. And we've all spent hundreds of hours polishing our stories. But rewriting and re-editing doesn't really provide any real insights into the subject of consciousness, because the rewrites and the re-edits are done for someone else's consciousness. So we're still looking through rather than looking inward. The first level of looking inward is recognizing the emotional memories that the story stimulates. Feel-its. And the emotions are what you have bottled up. And now you're making some progress, because the longer you experience these memories, the more you will own them and the less attention-grabbing they become. And the next stage of looking inward occurs after you have reviewed and re-edited the movie many times. You start to focus on the beliefs behind the emotions. Now you're beginning to understand the shape and structure of your mind bottle, and you're gaining valuable first-hand knowledge on about the core of the drama. And in the future, when you decide to deliberately direct your own movie as a source being, you can decide which beliefs to leave in and which beliefs to discreate. Otherwise, you get to shape the bottle. Now, after this point, most people don't pay much attention to their story. The bottle is empty and there's just too much else to see. And you start to focus on various identities, relationships, values, intentions that are creating the world around you.